Hey everybody, this is the final section actually from Anselm Jappe's Guy Debord, or Guy Debord, excuse me. Uh, Never pronounce his name right. Um, this section is titled Two Sources and Two Aspects of Debord's Theory. It's from part 3 of the book, part 3 being titled Theory, Past and Present. The section I read before this is titled The Aporias of the Subject and the Prospects for Action. So, thank you for listening. Here we go. Two sources and two aspects of Debord's theory. What is truly new in Debord's theory derives ultimately from his assignment of a fundamental role in modern society to exchange and the principle of equivalence. This was already one of the cardinal concerns of the young letterist, as witnessed the title of their paper, Potlatch. No explanation of this title was offered when the letterists first began sending out their free newsletter in 1954, but in 1959, presenting the first and last issue of a projected, quote, news series, end quote, Potlatch was by now an internal publication of the Situationist International. Debord refers explicitly to the Indian custom of potlatch and announces that, quote, the non-saleable goods that a free bulletin such as this is able to distribute are novel desires and problems, and only the further elaboration of these by others can constitute the corresponding return gift, end quote. The reader may recall that potlatch was practiced by certain Native American tribes in Canada who survived into the 20th century, and that similar customs have been followed by cultures elsewhere. The idea is that the prestige of an individual or group may be asserted by means of a gift offered to a rival. The latter must reciprocate, if he wishes to avoid acknowledging the supremacy of the giver, with a more valuable offering, and so on back and forth, sometimes to the point where one party or the other ostentatiously destroys their entire fortune. Potlatching is thus based less on equivalence than on the deliberate waste of resources, which are surrendered without any certainty of ever receiving, indeed even with the secret desire not to receive, an equivalent form in return, an equivalent value in return. Marcel Mauss introduced the notion of potlatch into anthropology in his celebrated work on the gift of 1924, but it was above all thanks to Georges Bataille's The Accursed Share of 1949 that it became part of the common currency of French thought and took on the role of a sort of alternative to the idea of an economy founded on exchange. Footnote: Marcel Mauss, The Gift, forms and functions of exchange in archaic societies. Translated by Robert Hurley. Translated by I. Cunnison. N.C. Georges Bataille's La Part Maudite. English translation by Robert Hurley. The Accursed Share, an essay on general economy. Volume 1, Consumption. Bataille had first discussed potlatch in the wake of Mauss in La Notion de Dispense, La Critique Sociale, 7, January 1933, English translation by Alan Stokel, and others in Bataille, Visions of Excess, Selected Writings 1927 to 1939. The young letterist who may have come across the notion in Société Civile Barbarie, in whose pages Claude Lefort summarizes Mauss's Essai sur les dons, when this was reissued in 1950, in Homo Ludens, 1938, a book that Debord quite liked, Johann Huizinga too had discussed potlatch. End footnote. To work out a critical theory based on the category of exchange as Debord did, and as the Frankfurt School did in a different way, represented a significant advance relative to the Marxism of the old working class movement, for which the only form of exchange that counted was the, quote, unequal, end quote, exchange constituted by the trade and labor power. In the eyes of, quote, Marxists, end quote, of this persuasion, giving pride of place to exchange amounts to attending first and foremost to the social sphere and to intersubjective relationships to the detriment of any consideration for the relationship between man and nature, that is to say, for the objectivity that only the analysis of production can vouchsafe. When in 1967 Lukács drew up the list of errors he felt he had committed in history and class consciousness, he made a number of observations which he would surely have considered equally applicable to that book's latter-day scion, the Society of the Spectacle. Thus, according to its author, history and class consciousness falls in with, quote, the tendency to view Marxism exclusively as a theory of society, as social philosophy, and hence to ignore or repudiate it as a theory of nature, ... I argue in a number of places that nature is a societal category, and bracket, that only a knowledge of society and the men who live in society is of relevance to philosophy, end quote. And indeed, Lukács discerns an echo of this tendency in, quote, French existentialism and its intellectual ambiance, end quote. History and Class Consciousness, introduction, 1967 introduction. By the same token, the Hungarian philosopher rebukes his book and the, quote, tendency, end quote, to which it gives rise for not having analyzed labor, but only, quote, complex structures, end quote. Lukács asserts that this approach was nevertheless contrary to Lukács' subjective intentions and that Lukács had not meant to abandon the economic underpinnings of history. Quote, it is true that the attempt is made to explain all ideological phenomena by reference to their basis in economics, but despite this, the purview of economics is narrowed down because its basic Marxist category, labor, as the mediator of the metabolic interaction between society and nature, is missing, end quote. History and Class Consciousness. The inability correctly to gauge the weight of material objectivity is then linked by Lukács to Lukács' mistaken conflation of objectification and alienation. Seen in this light, the concept of the spectacle would seem to make an absolute of what might be called the superstructure, the realm of circulation, of consumption, in short, the social. But Debord rejects the criticism leveled at him by Claude Lefort, who, quote, falsely charges Debord with having said that, quote, the production of a phantasmagoria governs that of commodities, end quote, whereas, in fact, the very contrary is clearly stated in the Society of the Spectacle, notably in the second chapter, where the spectacle is defined as simply one moment in the development of commodity production, end quote. Still, very great importance is obviously given in Debord's analysis to culture, that is, the superstructure. In the early years, the situationists justified the situationists' attempts to achieve a sort of, quote, hegemony, end quote, in the cultural sphere on the grounds that culture was, quote, the center of meaning of a society without meaning, end quote. To use a more sociological language, one might say that they had identified culture as a locus of, quote, consensus creation, end quote. In their definition, it covered a vast area, taking in everything that was not simply reproduction. Later on, the situationists turned their attention to the critique of ideology, and when Debord defines the spectacle as, quote, ideology of material form, end quote, it is clear that Debord conceives of it as much more than a, quote, superstructure, end quote. In its analytical role, the concept of the spectacle explains how the process of abstraction transforms both thought and production. It thus tends clearly in the direction of supersession of such dualisms as those between, quote, base and, quote, superstructure, quote, appearance and, quote, essence, quote, being and, quote, consciousness, which were made so much of by sociologizing, quote, Marxism, end quote, that failed to see that value is a, quote, total social fact, end quote, as Marcel Mauss would say, itself responsible for instituting division in different spheres. This brand of Marxism proceeded to pass off as, quote, dialectics, end quote, its lubrications on the, quote, reciprocal relations, end quote, between the very realms that it had already made into watertight compartments. The situationists failed to respect the base superstructure distinction in what the situationists failed to respect the base superstructure distinction was thus no shortcoming on the situationist's part, but indeed an important theoretical advance for which support in Hegel and Marx could quite legitimately be claimed. Likewise, their refusal to make labor the basis of their theory was by no means a fault. Conceptions of labor like that of Lukács in 1967 mentioned earlier turn a characteristic of capitalism into an eternal ontological necessity. To describe labor as, quote, an organic exchange with nature, end quote, is to state a truth, but a truth with no more conceptual utility than the assertion that human beings must breathe in order to live. But if it is understood as a specific modality for organizing this exchange, then labor may be seen as, on the contrary, as a historical datum, potentially transcended by the evolution of capitalism itself. The bartering of measures of work objectified as commodities would be superfluous in the context of a directly socialized mode of production. The present mode of production is already socialized in the material sense, even if it is still unable to free itself from a system in which individuals partake of the collective product solely by virtue of what each contributes by way of labor. The situationist critique of work does not make them into old-fashioned bohemians, therefore, but rather into genuine anticipators from a Marxist point of view of a thoroughly modern phenomenon. Debord's ideas have benefited in this regard from the fact that Debord's ideas began as reflections on art. The resulting emphasis is characteristically French, expressing a tendency to stress the, quote, social, end quote, aspect as opposed to the, quote, harsh realities, end quote, of economics. Footnote. Thus, authors, including both Lefebvre and Sartre, prefer the purely intersubjective concept of, quote, action to that of, quote, labor, end quote, which implies a relationship between man and nature, end footnote. Yet there is also a hidden animosity here and a fully justified animosity, albeit somewhat distorted, toward a, quote, Marxism, end quote, which reduced a mere guarantee of economic modernization. The particular way in which Debord and the situationists came to be among the first to perceive, at least in part, the new conditions created. One second. Sorry, my neighbor was outside, and I'm on friendly terms with him, and I didn't want to be rude to him by, like, ignoring him if he ended up saying hi to me. The particular way in which Debord and the situationists came to be among the first to perceive, at least in part, the new conditions created by the end of the Fordist period is a function of the break the situationists represent relative to practically all previous social criticism. If the situationists were able to break new ground in this area at the same time exhuming a number of buried aspects of Marxian theory, this was precisely because they had not emerged from Marxism's internal debates. The situationists understood that Marxist theories too needed to be subjected to détournement, to be turned around and inserted into a new context, and in this way revalidated. And if they were ready to perform such a détournement, that readiness was founded on their experience of the decay of the arts. The situation brought about by the end, real or presumed, of poetry, like the desire to construct a passionate everyday life, was at the center of Debord's preoccupation long before he began thinking about Marxist theory. The artistic sign of the Situationist International would turn out to be a serious obstacle later, when the need arose for a sect, itself conceived of as the supreme work of an art without works, to be transformed into a mass movement. Yet it was precisely those origins which enabled the Situationist International to find the Situationist International's, quote, Northwest Passage, end quote, at any rate in the realm of Marxist theory. As has already been stressed more than once, the various strands of Marxism all developed within the confines of a system of socialization defined by value and never went beyond calling for a, quote, juster, end quote, organization of that system, liberation from abstract labor. Money, the state, and production as an end in itself was at best deferred to a far distant future for consideration only after the social forms created by the commodity had been effectively extended to the whole of society. Even heretical Marxisms demanded nothing more in essence than a more radical or more democratic management of the existing arrangements. It is fair to say, therefore, that apart from the French utopian socialist tradition as exemplified by Charles Fourier, only the artistic avant-gardes in general, and on a more conscious level, Surrealism had ever voiced the demand for a liberation that was genuinely concrete, and that, even if conceived in a somewhat ingenious way, really looked beyond the horizon of industrial society. Only here, in other words, could one find the rudiments of a kind of thinking that transcended the categories manufactured by the commodity form, and this was the tradition that carried Debord to a threshold that had art remained beyond the reach of such theoretical undertakings as argument or socialisme ou barbarie, whose attempts to rejuvenate Marxism did not start from Marx himself, and thus failed to grasp that the economism they objected to could most effectively be contested by recourse to the, quote, critique of political economy, end quote. So, yeah, I think it's definitely a true thing that, a true statement to be said that socialisme ou barbarie, their interests are on like a higher register of or like a more empirical level, on a more political level. Basically, like a lot of people in this time, prior to like the Marx revival, the revival of the interest in the critique of political economy that would emerge in the 60s, whether it be Tronti or Althusser or Neue Marx Lectura people, that prior to like this, like they're operating before then, so their main circles of concern are less with like the higher levels of abstraction that characterize like Capital Volume 1, and also they were writing before the Grundrisse became widely available and popular. So I think what there's a certain degree to which Socialisme Barbarie, what Jappe is saying about Socialisme Barbarie is true in this interest, in this instance. Okay. Anyway, these groups strove to make up for the shortcomings of Marxism as a whole by interjecting foreign elements. Despite the great merit of its critical analysis of the Soviet Union, Socialisme Barbarie clung to an entirely trivial, sociologically inclined Marxism, far removed from a critique of the value form or commodity fetishism, while at the same time incorporating material in the most uncritical manner from other disciplines such as anthropology and psychology. This purely mechanical assimilation of elements that in themselves had not been subjected to critical scrutiny was naturally unsatisfactory. It is hardly surprising that after a few years the likes of Edgar Morin and Cornelius Castoriadis should have completely turned their backs on any serious critical approach to society. A complete and total falsification. That actually is completely untrue of Cornelius Castoriadis. I can't speak on Edgar Morin, but that is absolutely untrue of Cornelius Castoriadis. Debord was thus one of the few people in a position to carry a social critique. If you're interested in Castoriadis beyond just reading Castoriadis himself, if you're looking for a book that's kind of like similar to Guy Debord by Anselm Jappe, I would highly recommend checking out Christos Memos' book on Castoriadis. It's very good. Which is critical of Castoriadis without kind of making these blunt assertions about Castoriadis turning his back on a critique of society. That's not true. Debord was thus one of the few people in a position to carry a social critique beyond the various forms of the Marxism of the working class movement, which in 1968 experienced one more deceptive Indian summer. Just before the process of modernization ended and turned into a catastrophe, it was not then easy to understand that almost all varieties of opposition to capitalism had taken aim only at what was extraneous to the pure value form, and that consequently it made no sense to continue along the same path. This reversal of perspective was apprehended first in the realm of the arts. Footnote. See my article, Sic transit gloria artis, Theorien über das Ende der Kunst bei Theodor W. Adorno und Guy Debord in Crisis 15, 1995. English translation coming forth in the journal Substance. We'll see. Avant-garde and footnote. Avant-garde and formalist art between 1850 and 1930 meant destroying traditional forms far more than creating new forms. This process of destruction had an eminently critical function linked to the historical period during which the social system founded on exchange value became dominant. The relationship between modern art and the development of the logic of exchange value was ambiguous in a number of ways. On the one hand, modern art registered the dissolution of the old ways of life and modes of communication of traditional communities in a negative fashion, shocking by means of, quote, incommensurability, end quote, was intended to point up this disappearance. Well before the advent of the avant-garde in any strict sense, nostalgia for a lost, quote, authenticity, end quote, of lived experience had become one of the central themes of art, as witnessed the work of Flaubert. At the same time, however, art perceived that some dissolution as liberating potential, as opening up new horizons to life and experience. It thus gave an enthusiastic welcome to a process that amounted de facto to the decay of pre-bourgeois social formations and the emancipation of abstract individuality from pre-modern constraints. art conceived of these constraints, however, not just in terms of the exploitation and political oppression, as the workers' movement did, but also in terms of the family morality and everyday life, as well as structures of perception and thought. What neither art nor the workers' movement perceived was that the process of dissolution was in reality the triumph of the abstract monad of money. Art believed it was witnessing the beginning of a general disintegration of bourgeois society, including the state and the money system. What it was really witnessing was the victory of the most highly developed capitalist forms, among them precisely the state and money, over the remains of pre-capitalism. Footnote. Sometimes art made this belief explicit, as in the case of the Dadaists and the Surrealists, the Futurists, and the Constructivists. At other times it was merely implicit. End footnote. So it was that modern art unintentionally pointed the way to the complete rout by a subjectivity structured by value of all pre-bourgeois forms. The expectation that the overthrow of prevailing modes of production precipitated by capitalist development itself would, as a logical consequence, bring about the subversion of the traditional superstructures from sexual morality to the physical aspects of cities. Modern art naturally accused the, quote, bourgeoisie, end quote, of resisting change in order to keep its grip on power, yet it was itself grievously mistaken in its view that such subversion would be championed. Mallarmé's, quote, Mallarmé's, quote, destruction was my Beatrice, end quote, was realized in ways very far removed from anything the poet could have imagined, for it was capitalist society itself that in the end turned everything upside down. We have indeed witnessed the break of new paths and the abandonment of old traditions, but so far from delivering individual lives from archaic and stifling bonds, the aim has been to tear down all obstacles to the total transformation of the world into commodities, giving free rein to unconscious drives, contempt for logic, the cultivation of surprises, arbitrary and fantastical combinations. The whole surrealist agenda has been carried through by the juggernaut of state and economy in ways the surrealists never remotely anticipated. The decomposition of artistic forms has thus become perfectly concordant with the real state of the world and retains no shock effect whatsoever. Meaningless aphasia, incomprehensibility, or irrationality, as say in the work of Beckett, can now appear to us only as an integral and indistinguishable part of the world around us, contributing not to a critique but to an apology. The most conscious elements in the artistic avant-gardes were the first to realize that the continuation of their critical work required a revision of perspective. In 1948, when asked whether the surrealists of 1925 would not have gone so far as to hail the atomic bomb in the desire to shake up the bourgeois order, André Breton replied as follows, quote, "In la lampe dans l'orage, or l'horloge, you'll see that I have no trouble explaining this crucial variation, the lyrical aspiration toward the end of the world and its subsequent retraction owing to new facts," end quote. Breton. In 1951, Breton summed up in a few eloquent words the great change that had occurred in less than 3 decades, a change which, we might add, has continued to occur at an ever-increasing pace in the years since. Quote, "In France, for example, the mind was threatened back then with coagulation, whereas today the mind is threatened with dissolution," end quote. Breton. The situationists are heir to this self-criticism of the earlier avant-gardes, who frequently declared allegiance to the, quote, irrational, end quote, and constituted a genuine protest against the tight fetters imposed by so-called rationality on the human possibilities foreshadowed in the realm of the imaginary and the unconscious. It is altogether typical of the course of this century that the critique of life in capitalist society should have been undertaken first by the surrealists as a critique of excessive rationalism, whereas the inheritors of this critique were eventually driven to conclude that even the mean-spirited rationalism of the 19th century, so bitterly mocked by the surrealists, seemed like great wisdom as compared with the spectacle's galloping irrationalism. What Debord took the surrealists to task for was precisely their embrace of the irrational, and in this connection, Debord insisted on the need, quote, to rationalize the world more as the first step to impassioning it, end quote. In 1932, the surrealists had presented, quote, experimental research on some possible irrational beautifications for the cities, end quote. In 1956, Potlatch published a humorous, quote, plan for the rational beautification of the city of Paris, end quote. So let me repeat that. In 1932, the Surrealists had presented, quote, experimental research on some possible irrational beautifications for cities, end quote. In 1956, Potlatch published a humorous, quote, plan for the rational beautification of the city of Paris, end quote. What the Surrealists rejected in Surrealism was that, thus, an idealist view of history that sees it as nothing but a struggle between the irrational and the tyranny of the logico-rational. Likewise, the Situationists never cultivated the idea of disorder as an end in itself. In Debord's words, quote, victory will be for those who have known how to create disorder without loving it, end quote. Quote, victory will be for those who have known how to create disorder without loving disorder, end quote. Much of the same sort of thing might be said of humanist culture or the relationship with the past. The Situationists always despised the, quote, beautiful soul, end quote, humanism of people who in the last reckoning wanted nothing more than a comfortable niche in the spectacle. They held that it was meaningless to contrast bad mass media with good, quote, high culture, end quote, or with artistic fulfillment, neither of which were in reality any less alienated. Initially, the Situationist International argued that a race was on between, quote, free artists and the police, end quote, for control of the, quote, new technique of conditioning, end quote, while, quote, the whole humanistic, artistic, juridical conception of the personality is inviolable and unalterable has been abandoned, and we are only too happy to see it go, end quote. Footnote. That's in Christopher Gray's edited volume, Leaving the 20th Century, the Incomplete Work of the Situationist International. End footnote. Where am I? On the matter of works of the past, however, Debord changed his mind. In 1955, according to Potlatch's report on the meeting concerned with the aforementioned, quote, plan for the rational beautification of the city of Paris, end quote, Debord declared himself in favor of, quote, the complete demolition of religious buildings of all denominations, end quote. Along with his fellow letterists, he felt that, quote, aesthetic objections should be overruled. What admirers of the great Porto of Chartres should be silenced. Beauty, when it does not hold the promise of happiness, must be destroyed. Beauty, when it does not hold the promise of happiness, must be destroyed, end quote. Many years later, Debord found to the contrary that the most astonishing thing imaginable now would be, quote, to see a Donatello reemerge, end quote. That, quote, American-style, end quote, restoration of the Sistine Chapel or of Versailles was a crime, and that a few old buildings and a few old books were perhaps the only things that had not been transformed by modern industry. At the outset, the Situationists had wanted to be, quote, partisans of forgetting, end quote. They could hardly have foreseen that the spectacle itself would take charge of consigning the old historical past to oblivion and destroying everything, quote, old-fashioned, end quote, that impeded its progress, without helping the revolutionary project in the slightest. In such circumstances, however, the past, as imperfect and even execrable as it might be, sometimes becomes a lesser evil and must often be defended, quote, when, quote, to be absolutely modern, end quote, has become a special law decreed by a tyrant. What the honest slave fears more than anything is that the honest slave might be suspected of being behind the times, end quote. Excuse me, I'm getting lost here. At the outset, the Situationists had wanted to, quote, to be, quote, partisans of forgetting, end quote. The Situationists could hardly have foreseen that the spectacle itself would take charge of consigning the whole historical past to oblivion and destroying everything, quote, old-fashioned, end quote, that impeded the spectacle's progress, without helping the revolutionary project in the slightest. In such circumstances, however, the past, as imperfect and even execrable as the past might be, becomes a lesser evil and must often be defended, quote, when, quote, to be absolutely modern, end quote, has become a special law decreed by a tyrant. What the honest slave fears more than anything is that the honest slave might be suspected of being behind the times, end quote. Footnote. This does not, however, imply a nostalgia for some lost golden age. Quote, I indicate in the spectacle the 2 or 3 periods in which it is possible to discern a measure of historical life in the past and their limits. If you look at things dispassionately, it does not seem as if, out of the entire existence of the world, we ever had very much to lose." End quote. End footnote. That which in the past had taken itself for a radical challenge to bourgeois society ended up clearing away only things that were obsolete and in any case destined to be swept aside by the victory of the commodity. Debord alludes to this in his last film, Guy Debord, Son Art et Son Thème, assimilating the Dadaist revolt, that is to say, one of the moments to which the situationists referred continually to the most contemptibly modern phenomena, which he calls, quote, state data, end quote. Dave Behrend's stripped columns at the Palais Royal, compared by Debord to the, quote, barcodes, end quote, now widely used to identify merchandise. The fact is that Dada, like other iconoclastic movements, was the all-unknowing precursor of today's urbanist, whose job it is, where they are unable to destroy something outright, at least to strip it of any historical depth and hence of any memory of past distinct from the spectacle. By introducing utterly unrelated architectural elements into the courtyard of the Louvre or into the Palais Royal, these buildings are reduced to the status of mere backdrops and become, in effect, as fake as everything else. For a long time, the task of the critique of society was to combat the, quote, old, end quote, from historical city centers to classical philosophers, from the institution of the family to traditional trades and crafts. The first point to be made here is that power appropriates any number of innovations proposed or actualized by its opponents. The practice of détournement, as defined by the situationists, is strictly an epiphenomenon by comparison with the gigantic détournement perpetrated upon all the revolutionary tendencies of the century. The situationists knew this, of course, quote, power creates nothing, power co-ops, end quote. The fact remains that the meaning of détournement is tied to the subjectively subversive intentions of its practitioners, the objective content of whose actions so often harmonize with the profound orientation of a society ruled by the commodity. Consider, for instance, an area where the situationists were true pioneers, their contempt for the work ethic and conviction that labor was absolutely nothing more than a source of income, still, but only temporarily, an unfortunate necessity. Today this view is almost universally accepted, not that it has in any way affected our, quote, work-based society, end quote. On the contrary, the spectacular system has only benefited from the dissolution of all kinds of occupational associations, from the loss of specific skills, and from the general lack of identification with a trade of one's own, all of which encourage the disappearance of all quality from life and justify every sort of aberration. As Debord himself remarks in his comments on the society of the spectacle, quote, it is disorienting to consider what it means to be a judge, a doctor, or a historian not so long ago, and to recall the obligations and imperatives they often accepted within the limits of their competence, end quote. Today, by contrast, we are witnessing the sudden parodic end of the division of labor, end quote. Another point on which the situationists were ahead of their time and in tune, as may be seen in hindsight with the underlying trends of the last few decades, was the fact that they dubbed, quote, alienating or, quote, spectacular any activity that did not have its aim the immediate satisfaction of the individual's needs or desires. However justified it might have been in the 60s to mock political militants who forgot their own misery by identifying with far-off events or the actions of political leaders, that mockery was in fact a prefigurement of the attitude of those who today will hear nothing of wars and disasters that are, quote, no concern of theirs, end quote. Clearly such developments were not foreseen, nor could they have been. In conclusion, it is worth pointing out that some of the most powerful features of Debord's theory belong to the tradition, in its continuity and self-criticism of Enlightenment philosophy. In other words, they belong to the, quote, dialectic of Enlightenment, end quote, in Adorno and Horkheimer's sense. Emphasis on dialectic. Quote, in the most general sense of progressive thought, the Enlightenment has always aimed at liberating men from fear and establishing their sovereignty, end quote. In the most general sense of progressive thought, the Enlightenment has always aimed at liberating men from fear and establishing their sovereignty, end quote. Footnote. Max Horkheimer and Theodore W. Adorno, Dialectic of Enlightenment. The situationists always had an elective affinity for the philosophy of the Enlightenment. For a time, Mustafa Kayati entertained the notion of producing a new encyclopedia. I don't know how to say that, encyclopedia, which is written by people like most famously Diderot. But that's actually an interesting statement. The situation always had an elective affinity for the philosophy of the Enlightenment. For a time, Mustafa Kayati entertained the notion of producing a new encyclopedia. This is extremely important, right? Because the critique of the Enlightenment is sometimes turned into counter-Enlightenment, and you see this in all kinds of different ways. The quasi-subversive championing of reactionary contestations of modernity. For instance, as manifested most prominently, this tendency is most prominently represented in the left by cheerleading for Islamism, right? So, when people like Debord, Foucault celebrate the Islamist revolution in Iran as, it's really sticking it to, the Western Enlightenment camp. You see that's a very important thing, is that the critique of Enlightenment, or the dialectic of Enlightenment, the dialectical critique of Enlightenment is not a condemnation of Enlightenment, but at least in my opinion, at least my viewpoint, I'm not an expert on dialectics, nor am I an expert on the Enlightenment, but to my understanding of dialectic of Enlightenment, what is meant is critiquing the instrumental, subjective rationality of the Enlightenment, which came to dominate over the striving for sovereignty in the Enlightenment. This quote that's being used here is like liberating men from fear and establishing their sovereignty. That's the other side of the Enlightenment, right? So like Kant's if you read like Kant, for instance, is like, what is Enlightenment? It's like human beings becoming self-conscious, removed from prejudice, and like self-awakening, right? This kind of like there's a very democratic aspect in Enlightenment. Sorry, I'm like, my brain is farting out on me. Like Kant's what is Enlightenment is like, it says I'm trying to think of the snappy phrase, something like humanity coming out, probably said man, but like humanity emerging from its self-imposed immaturity. So it's like a self-liberation of human consciousness from irrationality and ignorance. That's what Enlightenment is. And that aspect of the Enlightenment has entirely been subordinated by the will to control nature, including human nature, which constitutes a form of heteronomy over human beings, right? So, like, if you think of, like, the instrumental rationality of capital, which I think is way more of a concrete and less abstract notion of the problems with rationality than just saying, like, the instrumental rationality as such. Anyway, what came to dominate in Enlightenment is this kind of heteronomous scientism that kind of viewed the world and large parts of humanity within that world as instruments to be subordinated to the realization of some kind of abstractly conceived higher purpose, such as like, a very Promethean kind of like technological total domination of humanity over nature. Humanity in quotes. Obviously, it's not humanity as a whole, but particular segments of humanity. That's the one moment of enlightenment. The other is like the one that I've been talking about, of like overcoming heteronomy, overcoming domination. And what is emphasized is in like critical theory is like realizing that second portion, realizing that overcoming of humanity being dominated by the products of its own hand, whether that be religion or whether that be a capitalist mode of production and commodity production, overcoming of those irrational forms which come to be, which are created by human beings and come to dominate human beings. That's the other end of the ambition of the Enlightenment, and to try to subordinate that instrumental rationality to human purposes. Werner Bonafelt has this really, really good phrase that he says a couple times. So it's like turning the means of production into means of emancipation, right? So converting human practice from production for the sake of production, as under when human activity is subsumed under capital, to activity for the sake of human activity to actually serve human ends. That's the segment of that portion of the Enlightenment, that dimension of the Enlightenment is absolutely worth saving. Whereas kind of like the post-modern, and I'm not much of an expert, admittedly, on like the post-colonial critique is just like a kind of sort of condemnation of the Enlightenment as such, a very more totalizing critique of the Enlightenment, which is completely negative, which isn't trying to, kind of a Aufheben moment toward the Enlightenment, where like what is best in it is preserved and what is dehumanizing in it abandoned. It's just like abandon the whole thing. And usually this comes into like a term, like usually it's often terms in like viewing like democracy and equality and fraternity and universalism as just like vacuous ghosts that just merely perpetuate power. And obviously there's something to be said for that in a limited way, but hypocrisy, the hypocrisy of certain quasi-enlightenment projects does not condemn enlightenment as such. Sorry, this is just me rambling, talking to myself, and thinking out loud. Like, the answer to imperialism is not. I don't know. Sorry, I'm getting distracted with my own bullshit. But the point is that I'm saying is that the critical affirmation of the Enlightenment is something that people of anti-capitalist bent need to embrace or need to defend against irrational, theocratic, particularist, mystificatory bullshit. And we need to hold out, we need to consistently, we need to not view fetishism as a trans-historical fact of life. We need to combat fetishism and ontologization of particular historical forms, whether they be particular religions or a capitalist mode of production, and defend the idea that humanity, there are superior and inferior types of society, and that we need to strive for a superior type based on free and equal communist individuals, or something like that. That needs to be preserved. Yeah. Anyway, let's go. Where the hell am I? Talking out my ass so much. So I'll just read the last sentence again. In other words, the situationists belong to the, quote, dialectic of enlightenment, end quote, in Adorno and Horkheimer's sense. Quote, in the most general sense of progressive thought, the Enlightenment has always aimed at liberating men from fear and establishing their sovereignty, end quote. The philosophy of the Enlightenment continually strove to show that the forces dominating society were of human origin, and at least that it is possible for man to bring them under rational control. Right? So that does not mean affirming some fetishistic forms and damning other fetishistic forms, or just mediocrely accepting fetishistic forms. That's basically what I'm getting to that. Religion was long this philosophy's chief target, and Debord considers that the spectacle is, quote, the air of religion, end quote. Another side note, I can't remember the exact context of it, and I might be misusing it, but for Marx, all critique begins with the critique of religion. All critique begins with the belief that in the social, in some sense, that seems to me to mean like all critique begins with the acknowledgement that human society is humanity's creation, and not the creation of God or nature. So beginning the critique, say, of commodity fetishism begins with the critique of religion. And Marx says something, he doesn't say exactly that you need to have a critique of religion in order to have a critique of commodity fetishism, but to understand the way that human practical activity can be grow autonomous from the will of individuals and operate as a governing law of their behavior behind their backs. One needs to understand first, he can draw an analogy from the misty realms of religion, where the products of men's heads, the social creation of that religions are, come to dominate human activity. So like these, all these kind of like human created mystifications come to like have a real bearing on the way human beings think and experience the world. And in order to get beyond that kind of mystificatory domination, one has to acknowledge first and foremost that like these religions are human creations and not creations directly given to humanity by nature or the divine. Anyway, religion was long this philosophy's chief target, and Debord considers that the spectacle is, quote, the air of religion, end quote, and that would make complete sense, considering that you can say that that commodity fetishism is a sort of religion of everyday life. Both constitute contemplation by humanity of its own separate powers. It is no coincidence that forms of, quote, fetishism, end quote, are present in religion, just as forms of fetishism are in the modern system of production. Likewise, Debord compares art to religion. Material development had now succeeded in removing any justification for all those forms that had hitherto been at once cause and effect of the impossibility of fulfilling individual desires directly. Henceforward, however, quote, the construction of situations will replace the theater only in the sense that the real construction of life has tended more and more to replace religion, end quote. That's a good quote. Henceforward, however, quote, the construction of situations will replace the theater only in the sense that the real construction of life has tended more and more to replace religion, end quote. The situationist program, seeking as it did to abolish whatever had become separate from individuals, the economy, the state, religion, works of art, so that they could proceed unhindered to construct their own everyday life, was without question a continuation of the work of demystification undertaken by Marx and Freud. Kant defined Aufklärung as, quote, for man the way out of his minority status, end quote. According to Debord, the spectacle keeps people in a state of infantilism, producing the conditioned, quote, need to imitate that the consumer experiences, end quote, society of the spectacle, and creating a world where, quote, there is no entering into adulthood, end quote. Quote, there is no entering into adulthood, end quote. Debord's theory is a critique as much of the unfinished quality of Enlightenment philosophy as Enlightenment philosophy's reversal. Adorno and Horkheimer have described how Aufklärung falls back into myth and is transformed into a new form of domination as its rationality becomes autonomous and mutates into a fetishism of quantity. The spectacle described by Debord as a product of capitalist rationalization is also a new myth and a new religion generated from an Enlightenment philosophy that has not been thought through. It is the separation of human potential from the conscious global project. It is the separation of human potential from the conscious global project, and leads to the state of affairs where, in the terms of dialectic of enlightenment, quote, men expect that the world, which is without any issue, will be set on fire by a totality they themselves are, and over which they have no control, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. The relevance of Debord's thought no longer lies in Debord's desire to generalize a culture of play made possible by technical progress, but rather, today, in the fact that he supplies a new foundation for the contention of the young Marx that political economy is, quote, the denial of man accomplished, end quote. There is one comfort, at any rate, to be gleaned here from the liberatory project. For the first time, this project stands to benefit from man's instinct of self-preservation. In his film Critique of Separation of 1961, Debord notes that, quote, the problem is not that people live more or less poorly, but that people live in a way that is always beyond their control, end quote. In his film Critique of Separation 1961, Debord notes that, quote, the problem is not that people live in more or less poorly, but that people live in a way that is always beyond their control. Now, so many years later, the consequences for a society organized after this fashion are clear. A new critical theory so sorely needed at the present time, and the praxis that must accompany it, will surely recognize the true value of Debord's contribution. The end. Thank you for listening. That's the last section of the book that's in the book proper. There's an afterword that I'm going to read as a separate video. Thank you for listening.